Flight staff mock black woman for her attire. Her position as a UN ambassador stuns the crowd. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most unexpected places. What happens when someone's worth is judged only by their appearance, and they turn out to be someone who can change the rules entirely? In today's story, an ordinary flight becomes the stage for an extraordinary reckoning. A woman, dismissed and mocked for her attire, quietly carries a secret that will leave everyone stunned. And justice delivers its final word in a way no one saw coming. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy heartwarming stories of courage and justice, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more incredible tales. Your support means the world and helps us reach even more people with these powerful stories. Now, let's jump right in. The airport buzzed with a cacophony of announcements, the hum of rolling suitcases, and the murmur of travelers navigating their journeys. Standing in the first-class line, Amara Johnson adjusted the strap of her leather satchel and shifted her weight slightly. Her attire, a traditional flowing dress of rich indigo hues adorned with intricate gold embroidery, reflected her heritage with pride and simplicity. She had always believed in staying grounded, no matter how high her status soared. Today was no exception. She had flown countless times, but airports never failed to remind her of life's unpredictability. Amara was here for a critical diplomatic summit overseas, her role as a UN ambassador carrying the weight of global issues on her shoulders. Behind her, whispers broke the rhythm of her thoughts. Did she take a wrong turn? A young blonde flight attendant snickered, her voice low but sharp. She was speaking to a colleague, a tall man with a smug expression. She must be in the wrong line, he replied, barely suppressing a laugh. First-class passengers don't dress like that. Amara heard them, of course. Years of diplomacy had taught her to remain calm in the face of far worse. She didn't flinch, didn't turn, and certainly didn't let their words shake her. Instead, she adjusted her posture, lifting her chin slightly as she inched closer to the counter. The blonde attendant, her name tag reading Lauren, stepped forward with a bright but insincere smile. "Ma'am," she said, emphasizing the word as if it were a question. "This is the line for first class." Amara met her gaze, her own eyes calm yet commanding. "I am aware," she replied, her voice steady. Lauren's smile faltered. "Oh," she said, glancing at the ticket in Amara's hand. "May I see that, please?" Amara handed over the ticket without hesitation. Lauren's eyes scanned it quickly, her expression shifting to mild irritation. "This must be a mistake," Lauren said, holding up the ticket for her colleague to see. "Jake, take a look at this." Jake approached with exaggerated curiosity, looking from the ticket to Amara as though she were a puzzle to be solved. "Huh, maybe she found it," he suggested. Amara's lips curved into a faint smile, not out of amusement, but as a shield against their blatant disrespect. "I can assure you," she said, "there is no mistake." But Lauren wasn't ready to let it go. "You know," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "first class isn't just about the seat, it's about the experience." Her eyes flicked over Amara's dress. "Are you sure this is where you're supposed to be?" Amara held her ground, her voice unshaken. "Quite sure. Now if you'd kindly proceed with the check-in." Lauren hesitated, glancing at Jake as though seeking backup. Jake shrugged but smirked, his expression suggesting he enjoyed the spectacle. Behind Amara, a small crowd began to form. Other passengers, some looking on with curiosity, others with discomfort. "I think you might want to double-check your ticket," Lauren pressed, clearly relishing the attention. "Or perhaps," Amara said, her tone now sharper, "you should double-check your assumptions." A ripple of murmurs spread through the onlookers. Lauren flushed but didn't back down. Instead, she called over her supervisor, Sarah, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor. Sarah approached, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in the scene. "What seems to be the problem here?" Lauren wasted no time. This passenger claims to have a first-class ticket, but she trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Sarah's gaze shifted to Amara, scanning her from head to toe. Her expression hardened, and she didn't bother hiding her skepticism. "May I see your ticket?" Amara handed it over once again, her composure unbroken. Sarah examined it, then looked at Amara as though the ticket itself were a forgery. "This doesn't look right," Sarah said. "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside while we verify." For the first time, a flicker of frustration crossed Amara's face. "This ticket is valid," she said firmly, "and I am exactly where I need to be." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Ma'am, I'm not going to argue with you. Please step aside." Amara paused, her mind weighing her next move. She could escalate this, demand to speak to someone higher up, reveal who she was. But that wasn't her style. Not yet. Instead, she stepped aside, letting the crowd's murmurs grow louder as she moved to a nearby seating area. The whispers of disbelief, the barely concealed smirks, the stares, they all rolled off her like water off stone. For now, as she sat, she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. It wasn't to complain or call attention to herself. She had a message to send, a quiet ripple that would soon become a tidal wave. Lauren and Jake exchanged smug looks, unaware of the storm brewing just beyond their perception. Amara sat quietly in the seating area, her fingers gliding over her phone's screen as she composed a message with deliberate precision. The low hum of the airport buzzed around her, blending with the soft chime of departing flight announcements. The surrounding noise felt distant, almost muted, as her focus remained sharp. The message wasn't to escalate or retaliate. It was a notification, a necessary step to ensure that the right people knew what was happening. She sent the message with a calm certainty, placing her phone back into her satchel with a soft click of the clasp. Across the room, Lauren and Jake continued their mocking, their laughter subdued but audible enough to catch the attention of passengers nearby. "Can you believe the nerve?" Lauren whispered, her voice carrying just enough to reach Amara. "Dressed like that and claiming she's first class." Jake chuckled, leaning casually against the counter. "Maybe it's a prank or something. You know how people like to fake it these days." Amara's eyes remained forward, her hands resting gracefully in her lap. She wasn't oblivious to their words, but years of experience had taught her that dignity wasn't about reacting to every provocation. It was about choosing the right moment to act. Her patience wasn't out of fear or uncertainty. It was a calculated restraint. She had seen the power of timing, how it could shift a narrative entirely. This wasn't the first time she had faced prejudice, nor would it be the last. But this time, the weight of her position added a layer of significance to the encounter. The minutes stretched, each second pulling at the tension in the air. Other passengers shuffled in the line, glancing at Amara with expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. A few looked sympathetic, their eyes silently acknowledging the unfairness of the situation. "Ma'am," Sarah's voice interrupted the quiet resolve. She had returned, her tone sharp and devoid of any apology. "We've contacted someone to verify your ticket. Until then, you'll need to wait here." Amara looked up at the supervisor, her calm demeanor unbroken. "You mean to tell me that your system isn't capable of validating a first-class ticket? Or is this extra step necessary because I don't fit your preconceived notions?" Sarah bristled, her lips tightening into a thin line. "I'm just doing my job," she snapped, though her defensive tone betrayed her discomfort. Amara tilted her head slightly, studying Sarah's face. There was no need to argue further. The truth of the situation was plain for anyone paying attention. Instead, she offered a small, knowing smile and nodded. "Very well." Lauren and Jake exchanged uneasy glances. The calm in Amara's response unnerved them more than any outburst could have. They had expected indignation, perhaps even a raised voice. But this composed, dignified woman was an enigma they didn't know how to unravel. Minutes turned into nearly half an hour. Amara remained seated, her posture straight and unwavering. She didn't fidget or glance at her phone again. Instead, She watched the bustling scene around her, as if the world were a stage and she merely an observer. Then a shift. A man in a crisp suit, his airport badge gleaming under the overhead lights, entered the area with purposeful strides. His sharp eyes scanned the scene until they landed on Amara. Recognition dawned on his face immediately, and his pace quickened. "Your Excellency," his voice carried across the room, firm and respectful. The title hit the air like a thunderclap. Conversations halted mid-sentence, heads turned, and the collective focus of the room shifted to Amara. Lauren and Jake froze, their faces paling as they exchanged panicked looks. Amara stood, her movement fluid and composed, as though she had been expecting this moment. The man approached her with an outstretched hand, his expression a mixture of concern and deference. "Ambassador Johnson," he continued, his voice loud enough for all to hear. "I deeply apologize for the unacceptable treatment you've received. I assure you this matter will be addressed immediately." Amara inclined her head graciously. "Thank you for your prompt response," she said, her voice carrying the same quiet authority that had silenced countless boardrooms and diplomatic halls. Behind the counter, Lauren's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Jake took a step back, his usual confidence drained as he tried to process what was happening. "Ambassador?" Lauren finally whispered, her voice barely audible. The man turned sharply toward Lauren, his expression darkening. "You didn't recognize her?" he asked, his tone sharp and accusatory. Lauren stammered, her words tumbling out in a panicked rush. I didn't know. She didn't—" "You didn't bother to ask," the man cut her off. "And instead, you chose to mock and humiliate an esteemed diplomat representing not just her country, but global initiatives for peace and equality." Lauren's face turned crimson. Jake tried to edge away, but the man's pointed gaze stopped him in his tracks. "I'll be reporting this incident directly to the CEO," the man continued. "Expect immediate repercussions for your behavior." Amara watched the scene unfold with a quiet detachment. She didn't need to speak further. The weight of justice had already begun its descent. "Now, if you'll excuse us," the man said, turning back to Amara with a respectful bow, "allow me to personally escort you to your gate, Ambassador." Amara nodded, allowing him to guide her away from the counter. As they walked, the whispers and stares followed, but this time they carried a different weight, a mixture of awe, respect, and shame. Behind her, Lauren and Jake stood rooted in place, their world of assumptions crumbling under the weight of their actions. As Amara walked alongside the airport official, her steps deliberate and calm, the murmurs in the terminal seemed to ripple like waves in her wake. Passengers turned to each other, their voices hushed but tinged with intrigue. The stark transformation of the scene, a poised woman once dismissed now walking with the unmistakable authority of someone far greater than they had assumed, was a drama in itself. The official, whose name tag read Mr. Adler, gestured toward an elevator reserved for VIPs. "Ambassador Johnson," he began, his voice carrying an undertone of regret. "I can't express enough how sorry I am for what transpired back there. I've already informed upper management, and I assure you, corrective action will be swift." Amara turned her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. "It's not the first time," she said, her tone measured, "and I suspect it won't be the last." Adler looked down, his jaw tightening. He hesitated before speaking again. "It shouldn't have happened. Not to anyone, let alone someone of your stature." Amara stopped walking, turning fully to face him. Her gaze was steady, but carried a depth that made Adler stand a little straighter. "My stature," she said softly, "should not determine the respect I am shown. This is not about me. It is about a system of assumptions and biases that dehumanizes people based on appearances." Adler's face flushed. He nodded quickly. "You're absolutely right, Ambassador. I'll make sure that point is emphasized in the report." Amara gave a faint smile and resumed walking. "Good, because this isn't about retribution. It's about accountability." As they exited the elevator, They entered the tranquil luxury of the first-class lounge. The air was quieter here, the decor sleek and modern, a stark contrast to the chaos of the terminal below. A hostess approached, her polished demeanor faltering slightly as she recognized Amara from the commotion earlier. "Ambassador Johnson," Adler introduced, his voice formal. "Please ensure her utmost comfort until her flight is ready." The hostess nodded quickly, gesturing toward a private seating area. "Of course, sir. Ambassador, if there's anything you need, please let me know." Amara inclined her head graciously, taking a seat in one of the plush leather chairs. She exhaled softly, allowing herself a moment of stillness. But the weight of the earlier encounter lingered, not as an emotional burden, but as a reminder of how far society still had to go. Meanwhile, downstairs, Lauren and Jake stood at the counter, their faces pale and their movements stiff. The reality of their actions was beginning to sink in. Sarah, their supervisor, stood between them, her phone pressed to her ear as she received what was clearly an unpleasant call. "Understood," Sarah said tersely before hanging up. She turned to her staff, her face a mask of frustration. "We're in serious trouble. Do you have any idea who that woman is?" Lauren shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't know she was important," she mumbled, her voice weak. "Important?" Sarah snapped. "She's not just important. She's a United Nations ambassador. Do you understand the kind of press nightmare this could become?" Jake tried to interject, his usual bravado gone. "It was just a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Sarah's voice rose. "You mocked her, questioned her legitimacy, and refused to serve her. That's not a misunderstanding. It's blatant discrimination." Lauren's eyes filled with tears, her confidence crumbling under the weight of her actions. Jake remained silent, his gaze fixed on the floor. "The CEO wants a full report," Sarah continued, her voice cold. "And if I were you, I'd start preparing for the worst. This kind of behavior isn't just unprofessional, it's unacceptable." Back in the lounge, Amara's phone vibrated softly. She picked it up and saw a message from one of her colleagues at the UN. "Heard about the incident, are you all right?" She typed a quick response. "I'm fine. A reminder of why the work we do is so important." She placed the phone back in her bag, her thoughts drifting to the summit she was about to attend. The irony of it all wasn't lost on her. She was on her way to advocate for equality and justice, yet here she was, experiencing firsthand the very prejudice she fought against. A server approached cautiously, holding a tray with a cup of herbal tea. "Ambassador," he said, his voice slightly nervous. "This is on behalf of the lounge. We hope it helps make your wait more comfortable." Amara accepted the tea with a small nod. "Thank you." As she sipped, she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. It wasn't the tea or the apology that mattered. What mattered was the conversation that would follow, the ripple effect of what had happened today. She knew the wheels of change turned slowly, but they turned nonetheless. And for every moment like this, for every injustice endured, there was an opportunity to push those wheels forward. The announcement for her flight broke the stillness of the lounge. Amara rose, her movements deliberate as she gathered her belongings. She thanked the staff and walked toward the gate, where Adler was waiting to escort her onto the plane. As she boarded, heads turned again, passengers recognizing her from the earlier scene. But Amara walked with the same quiet dignity she had carried throughout, her presence a silent but powerful reminder of the strength in grace. And as she settled into her seat in first class, she allowed herself a small smile. The day's events were far from over, not for those who needed to learn their lessons. The soft hum of the plane's engines created a cocoon of quiet anticipation as Amara settled into her first-class seat. The leather chair was plush and inviting, the kind of luxury meant to erase any tension or discomfort. But Amara's mind was not on relaxation. Instead, it lingered on the events of the past hour, the cutting words, the dismissive glances, and the systemic rot that made such encounters all too common. Her fingers brushed over the hem of her dress, the intricate gold embroidery catching the light. Each thread told a story, a piece of her heritage, her identity, woven into something tangible and resilient. She carried that resilience now, a quiet strength that radiated in her posture, in her calm expression. As a flight attendant approached with a tray of champagne glasses, Amara glanced up. The woman's demeanor was professional, her smile practiced and polite, but there was an edge of tension in her movements. "Good afternoon, Ambassador," the attendant said, her voice careful, as if testing the waters. "Would you care for a drink before takeoff?" Amara studied her for a moment, sensing the unspoken apology in the woman's gaze. "No, thank you," she replied with a faint smile. The attendant nodded, relief flickering across her face, and moved to the next passenger. Amara leaned back in her seat, exhaling softly. She wasn't here to make anyone comfortable. The truth had a way of unsettling people, and she was content to let it. Meanwhile, in the airport's administrative offices, a storm was brewing. Lauren and Jake sat side by side in a cold, sterile conference room, their expressions a mix of defiance and fear. Sarah paced in front of them, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sharp clicks of her heels against the tiled floor. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Sarah demanded, finally breaking the tension. Her voice was low, but each word carried a sharp edge. "Do you understand the consequences of your actions?" Lauren opened her mouth to speak, but Sarah cut her off with a raised hand. "This isn't just about you," Sarah continued, her tone rising. "It's about the reputation of this airline, about how we're perceived on a global stage. And thanks to your behavior, we're facing a potential PR disaster." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his usual cocky demeanor nowhere to be found. "We didn't know she was an ambassador," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Sarah whirled on him, her eyes blazing. "And what if she wasn't? What if she was just an ordinary passenger? Does that make your actions acceptable?" The question hung in the air, heavy and damning. Lauren's face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. Jake stared at the table, his jaw clenched. Sarah shook her head, her voice dropping to a cold, steely tone. "You both will face disciplinary action. Suspension is the least of your worries. The CEO himself is involved now, and trust me, he's not inclined to be lenient." The weight of her words settled over them like a shroud. Back on the plane, Amara glanced out the window as the aircraft taxied toward the runway. The cityscape blurred into streaks of light, a reminder of the bustling world she was leaving behind for a while. Her thoughts were interrupted by Mr. Adler's voice, his tone respectful but firm. He had boarded the plane moments before takeoff, ensuring everything was in order. Now, he stood in the aisle near her seat, his hands clasped in front of him. "Ambassador Johnson," he said, drawing her attention. "I've spoken with the airline's CEO. He extends his deepest apologies and has assured me that immediate action will be taken to address this incident." Amara nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I appreciate the effort, Mr. Adler, but apologies mean little without tangible change." Adler's jaw tightened and he nodded solemnly. "You're absolutely right, Ambassador. The staff involved have already been suspended pending further investigation. Additionally, the CEO has approved mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for all employees, starting immediately." Amara's gaze softened slightly. "It's a start," she said. "But understand this. Change requires more than policies and training. It requires accountability at every level, a willingness to confront the biases that permeate our institutions." Adler's face flushed slightly, but he met her gaze with respect. "We'll do better," he said simply. Amara inclined her head, signaling the end of the conversation. Adler took his leave, his footsteps fading down the aisle. As the plane ascended into the sky, Amara closed her eyes, letting the hum of the engines lull her into a state of quiet reflection. Her work, she knew, was far from over. The summit awaited, a platform where her voice could amplify the struggles and triumphs of so many others. But today's events lingered in her mind like an unfinished symphony. Each note was a reminder of the barriers still to be dismantled, the stories still to be told. And as she sat in that first-class seat, high above the clouds, She resolved to turn this moment into a catalyst for change. Because justice wasn't just about grand gestures or sweeping reforms. It was about the quiet, deliberate acts of resistance that chipped away at the walls of prejudice, one brick at a time. And Amara Johnson was more than ready to wield the hammer. The descent into Geneva was smooth, the snow-capped Alps visible through the window like silent sentinels guarding the city below. Amara watched the landscape with an unwavering gaze, her thoughts a river of purpose flowing beneath her calm exterior. She had landed in Geneva countless times, but each arrival carried its own significance. This time, her steps were heavier with the memory of what had transpired before the flight, a reminder of why she fought the battles she did. As the plane came to a halt and passengers began to disembark, Amara waited. She had no desire to rush, no need to push through the crowd. Her patience was a choice, a quiet resistance to the urgency that seemed to grip everyone else. Mr. Adler was waiting near the gate as she exited, his posture stiff but his expression earnest. He bowed slightly, a gesture of respect that was almost apologetic. "Ambassador Johnson," he began, falling into step beside her. "If there's anything further I can do to assist you during your stay, please don't hesitate to ask." Amara offered him a polite nod. "Thank you, Mr. Adler. Your efforts are noted, and I appreciate them. But as I said, the work doesn't end with me. It must extend far beyond this moment." Her words were a gentle reprimand, and Adler nodded, his shoulders tightening slightly. "Understood, Ambassador. I'll ensure the message is carried forward." The car waiting for her outside was sleek and discreet, its windows tinted to shield her from the prying eyes of the world. As she slid into the back seat, the driver greeted her with a warm smile, his accent French. "Welcome back to Geneva, Ambassador," he said, his tone respectful but not overly formal. "Thank you," she replied, settling into the leather seat. The drive to the UN headquarters was brief, but gave Amara time to center herself. The streets of Geneva were immaculate, the winter air crisp and clean. Yet beneath the surface of this serene city was a hive of activity. Diplomats, activists, and leaders all converging to shape the policies that would ripple across nations. Inside the sprawling UN building, the atmosphere was charged with purpose. Delegates from all corners of the globe moved through the grand halls, their conversations a mix of urgency and diplomacy. Amara's arrival was met with nods of recognition and occasional greetings, but she moved with quiet determination, her presence commanding attention without demanding it. The summit chamber was a vast, circular room filled with rows of delegates. The air buzzed with anticipation as the day's session was called to order. Amara took her seat near the center, her nameplate gleaming under the soft lights. Ambassador Amara Johnson, United Nations Special Envoy for Equality and Justice. As the session began, speakers took turns addressing the assembly. Each voice carried the weight of their cause, the urgency of their mission. Amara listened intently, her hands resting lightly on the table in front of her. When her name was called, a hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to her as she rose, her movements deliberate and composed. She walked to the podium, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor, and adjusted the microphone. "Distinguished delegates," she began, her voice steady and resonant. "We gather here today not as representatives of nations, but as custodians of humanity's shared future." Her words hung in the air, drawing the room into her gravity. She paused, letting the weight of her message settle before continuing. "Earlier today," she said, her gaze sweeping across the room, "I experienced an incident that serves as a stark reminder of why we are here. An incident of prejudice, rooted in assumptions and ignorance, that could have easily been avoided with compassion and respect." The room was silent, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "This experience," she continued, "is not unique to me. It is a daily reality for countless individuals who are judged not for their character or contributions, but for the color of their skin, the language they speak, or the clothes they wear. It is a reality that demands our attention, our action, and our unwavering commitment to change." She paused again, her expression firm but not unkind. Equality is not an ideal to be admired from a distance. It is a practice, a discipline that must be woven into the fabric of our societies. And justice is not merely the absence of wrongdoing. It is the presence of accountability. The room remained rapt, the delegates hanging on her every word. "My role as an ambassador is not to dictate, but to advocate," she said, "to amplify the voices of those who have been silenced, to challenge the systems that perpetuate inequality, and to inspire each of you to do the same." Her voice softened slightly, a note of resolve threading through her tone. "Let us not forget that our work here is not about us. It is about the lives that depend on our decisions, the futures shaped by our policies, and the hope that we can create a world where dignity is not a privilege, but a right." She stepped back from the podium, her final words lingering in the air. "The work is hard, the road is long, but together we can ensure that justice is not a dream deferred, but a promise fulfilled." The room erupted into applause, a standing ovation sweeping through the chamber. Amara returned to her seat, her face calm but her heart steady with purpose. As the session continued, her words echoed in the minds of the delegates, a call to action that could not be ignored. And in the quiet of her own thoughts, Amara felt the stirrings of hope, not just for the summit, but for the change it could ignite. Because justice, she knew, was not an end. It was a journey. And she was ready to walk every step of the way. The applause from the summit chamber still echoed faintly in Amara's mind as she stepped into a smaller, private meeting room. The vastness of the main hall had given way to a more intimate space, yet the air was no less charged with purpose. This room was reserved for closed discussions, where decisions that shaped the world were often birthed in quiet debate and careful compromise. Amara stood by the window, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of the Geneva skyline. Snowflakes began to fall, delicate and transient, blanketing the city in a gentle hush. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. Change was often like this. Quiet, almost imperceptible at first, but powerful when it gathered momentum. The door behind her opened softly and footsteps approached. She turned to see a young delegate, her face earnest yet tinged with uncertainty. "Ambassador Johnson," the woman began, her voice steady but reverent, "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Amara offered a small, welcoming smile. "Not at all. Please, come in." The woman hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. She extended her hand, her grip firm but nervous. "My name is Eliana Mendez. I'm representing the Human Rights Youth Initiative." Amara's smile widened slightly. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Eliana. What brings you here?" Eliana took a breath, gathering her thoughts. "Your speech today, it was transformative. It resonated deeply with me, and I wanted to thank you. But more than that, I wanted to ask, how do you stay so composed, so resolute? After experiencing what you did, how do you keep going without letting the anger consume you?" Amara studied the young woman for a moment, sensing the weight of her question. She gestured toward a nearby chair, and they both sat. "It's not that I don't feel anger," Amara began, her voice low and deliberate. "I feel it deeply. Anger is a natural response to injustice, but anger, if left unchecked, can consume you. It can blind you to the very solutions you seek." Eliana nodded, her eyes intent. "So, how do you channel it?" Amara leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on her knees. "I remind myself of the purpose behind the fight. I remember that it's not about me. It's about the people whose voices aren't heard, whose lives are shaped by decisions they have no power to influence. And I use that anger to fuel action, not retaliation." Eliana's gaze softened, a flicker of understanding passing over her features. "You make it sound so simple," she said with a faint smile. Amara chuckled softly. "It's anything but simple. Every day is a choice to rise above the noise, to stand firm in the face of resistance, and to keep moving forward even when the path is unclear." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several other delegates, their presence filling the room with a sense of urgency. Amara stood, her demeanor shifting seamlessly into one of quiet authority. Ambassador Johnson, one of them, a seasoned diplomat named Pierre Laurent, greeted her. His French accent was thick, but his tone carried respect. "Your speech was remarkable as always, but I fear we must move from words to action quickly." Amara nodded. "That is why we're here, isn't it?" Pierre gestured toward a large table in the center of the room. On it were maps, reports, and a host of documents outlining pressing global issues. "We need to address the systemic inequalities within the economic aid programs," he said. "The current structures are failing to reach the most vulnerable populations." Amara approached the table, her eyes scanning the documents with practiced precision. "Failing how?" she asked, her tone sharp with curiosity. Pierre sighed. "Aid distribution is heavily influenced by political alliances. Resources often go to nations that align with the interests of donor countries, leaving others to suffer in silence." Amara's jaw tightened, the weight of his words settling heavily. "So, the aid serves politics, not people." "Exactly," Pierre said. "And the challenge lies in changing a system that has been entrenched for decades." Amara folded her arms, her mind already working through the complexities. "Then we need to redefine the parameters. Aid should be allocated based on need, not alliances. Transparency and accountability must be at the core of every decision." Another delegate, an older woman with sharp eyes and a quiet demeanor, spoke up. "That will require significant pushback from powerful nations. Are we prepared for that?" Amara's gaze swept the room, her voice steady and unwavering. "If we're not prepared, then we have no business being here. This is our responsibility. Change isn't about comfort, it's about courage." Her words hung in the air, a challenge that left no room for hesitation. The delegates exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of apprehension and determination. The discussion continued late into the evening, the room becoming a crucible for ideas and strategies. Amara's presence was a steadying force, her voice cutting through the noise with clarity and conviction. By the time the meeting adjourned, the outlines of a new framework had begun to take shape, a framework built on equity, transparency, and accountability. It was a small step, but a crucial one, and Amara felt the weight of its importance as she gathered her things to leave. Eliana lingered by the door, her expression thoughtful. As Amara passed, the young woman spoke softly. "You were right earlier. It's not simple, but it's worth it." Amara paused, her smile warm but tinged with fatigue. "Yes, Eliana, it's worth it." And as she stepped into the quiet corridor, the echoes of their work behind her, Amara felt a spark of hope. The seeds of change had been planted, and though the journey ahead was long, the path was now a little clearer. The night in Geneva was still, the city blanketed in a thin layer of snow that muffled the usual sounds of life. Amara stood on the balcony of her hotel suite, the cold biting at her skin through her shawl. She had left the heat of the room behind, craving the sharpness of the winter air to clear her thoughts. The summit's discussions played in her mind like a film reel, each conversation a fragment of a larger picture. Progress had been made, small, incremental progress, but she knew how fragile such victories could be. The framework they had begun to outline was a start, yet the true challenge lay in its implementation. Amara wrapped the shawl tighter around her shoulders and exhaled a plume of mist into the night. Her eyes drifted to the city lights, each one a beacon of life carrying its own story. It reminded her of where she had come from, the stories she carried with her, and the weight of her purpose. Her phone buzzed on the small table beside her. She glanced at the screen, seeing a name she hadn't expected. Dr. Elena Foster. Elena was more than a colleague, she was a friend, one of the few people who understood the depths of Amara's struggles and triumphs. She had been a mentor in Amara's early days as an advocate, guiding her through the labyrinth of diplomacy with a firm yet compassionate hand. Amara picked up the phone and answered. "Elena," she said, her voice soft but warm. "It's late for a call. Is everything all right?" On the other end, Elena's voice carried the same steady calm that Amara remembered. "I could say the same to you. I heard about what happened at the airport." Amara's lips curved into a faint smile, though there was no humor in it. "News travels fast." "It does when it involves you," Elena replied. "Are you all right?" Amara hesitated, the question digging deeper than she had anticipated. "I'm fine," she said finally. "But it was a reminder, a stark one." "Reminders can be painful," Elena said, her tone thoughtful. "But they can also be powerful. I've seen how you turn moments like these into something greater. You carry them with you, don't you?" Amara leaned against the railing, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "I have to. If I don't, who will? These moments aren't isolated incidents. They're threads in a much larger tapestry." Elena's voice softened. "You've always had a way of seeing the bigger picture. But don't forget that you're part of that tapestry too, Amara. You can't carry everything alone." The words lingered, their truth undeniable. Amara closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself to feel the weight of them. "I know," she said finally, "but it's not about me, Elena. It never has been." "And that's precisely why you've been able to do what you do," Elena replied. "But even you need moments of rest, Amara. Don't let the fire burn too hot." The call ended shortly after, but Elena's words stayed with her. Amara returned to the warmth of her suite, her thoughts quieter but no less poignant. She poured herself a cup of tea from the ornate set on the table and sat by the window, the steam rising in delicate curls. Her gaze fell on the notebook she carried with her everywhere. Its leather cover was worn, the pages filled with notes, reflections, and pieces of her journey that she had captured over the years. She opened it now, her fingers brushing over the handwritten words that filled the pages. Near the middle, she found an entry from years ago, written in the aftermath of another encounter with prejudice. The words were raw, etched with the pain and frustration she had felt then. "They will see the color of my skin before they see the strength of my mind. They will question my worth before they recognize my value. But I will not falter. I will not let their ignorance define me. My voice is my weapon, my resolve my shield. And I will fight, not just for myself, but for every soul silenced by the weight of judgment." Amara closed the notebook, her fingers lingering on the cover. The fight was ongoing, but the fire within her had not dimmed. It had only grown stronger. The following morning, as the city stirred awake, Amara prepared for the second day of the summit. Her movements were precise, almost ritualistic, as she dressed in a tailored suit that spoke of both elegance and authority. When she arrived at the UN building, the energy was different. Delegates greeted her with a newfound respect, their gazes lingering with admiration. News of her speech and the airport incident had spread, sparking conversations that rippled through the corridors. Amara took her place in the chamber, her presence a beacon of steadiness amid the buzz of activity. Today's agenda was critical, focusing on the implementation of the framework they had begun to craft. She knew the discussions would be challenging, the resistance palpable, but she was ready. The hours that followed were intense, the debates heated yet productive. Amara's voice remained a guiding force, her arguments laced with both logic and passion. She countered objections with grace, dismantled biases with precision, and inspired action with the quiet strength of her convictions. By the time the session ended, progress had been solidified. The framework was no longer a mere outline. It was a tangible plan, ready to be presented to the global stage. As the delegates dispersed, Amara lingered for a moment, letting the gravity of their work settle. Eliana approached, her expression a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. "We did it," the young delegate said, her voice tinged with disbelief. Amara nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "This is just the beginning," she said. "The true work lies ahead." Eliana's gaze was steady. "With leaders like you, I believe we can do it." Amara placed a hand on her shoulder, her smile widening slightly. "It's not about me, Eliana. It's about all of us, and together we will. As she left the chamber, the weight of the day still heavy but satisfying, Amara felt a quiet determination settle in her chest. The fight was far from over, but the seeds of change had been sown, and she would continue to nurture them, one step at a time. The final day of the summit began under a sky streaked with the soft hues of dawn, a quiet promise of renewal. Amara arrived early, her steps deliberate as she made her way through the UN building's grand halls. The air was heavy with the gravity of the work ahead, yet there was a faint hum of hope threading through the tension. Today they would present the finalized framework to the assembly. It was the culmination of hours of debate, compromise, and collaboration. But Amara knew this was not the end, only a marker on a long road. As she entered the chamber, a wave of greetings met her. Delegates from nations across the globe acknowledged her with nods and handshakes, their gestures carrying a newfound respect. Amara's speech from the first day had resonated deeply, sparking conversations that extended far beyond the summit walls. She took her seat near the center, her nameplate gleaming under the lights. The buzz of activity quieted as the session was called to order, and the chairperson invited Amara to the podium to present the framework. Amara stood, her movements composed, and approached the podium. The room fell into a deep silence as she began to speak. "Distinguished colleagues, today we take a step forward," she said, her voice steady and resonant. "This framework is not just a collection of policies. It is a testament to what we can achieve when we listen, when we challenge our biases, and when we prioritize humanity over politics." She detailed the key elements of the framework: transparent resource allocation, accountability mechanisms to ensure equity, and a commitment to prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable populations. Her words were precise, her tone unwavering, each sentence crafted to convey both clarity and conviction. "This is not a perfect solution," she admitted, her gaze sweeping the room. "But it is a foundation. It is a promise that we can and will do better. The responsibility now lies with us to uphold this promise and ensure it translates into action." The room remained silent for a moment after she finished, the weight of her words sinking in. Then, one by one, delegates rose to their feet, applause spreading across the chamber in a powerful wave. Amara returned to her seat, her expression calm, but her heart steady with resolve. The applause wasn't for her. It was for the collective effort, the shared vision of a better world. The rest of the day passed in a blur of discussions and formalities. The framework was adopted by the assembly, marking a significant milestone. Yet Amara's thoughts were already ahead, focused on the implementation and the challenges that would undoubtedly arise. As the summit drew to a close, Amara found herself standing in the building's atrium, gazing at a massive mural that depicted the UN's mission. The colors were vibrant, the imagery striking, a reminder of the ideals they all strived for, even when the path was difficult. Eliana approached, her expression a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. "Ambassador Johnson," she said, her voice carrying a note of reverence, "it's been an honor working alongside you. Your leadership has been transformative." Amara turned to face her, a small smile softening her features. "Thank you, Eliana. But remember, leadership isn't about one person. It's about the collective. The work we've done here belongs to all of us." Eliana nodded, her eyes shining. "I'll carry that with me." As Eliana walked away, Amara felt a sense of quiet pride. The young delegate's determination was a spark that would ignite change in her own corner of the world. That evening, as Amara prepared to leave Geneva, she stood once more on her hotel balcony. The snow had stopped, and the city lights shimmered like scattered stars. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the struggles, the victories, and the moments of doubt. Her mind drifted to the airport incident, a stark reminder of the work still to be done. Yet even in that moment, there had been a lesson, a chance to turn pain into purpose. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Change begins with one voice, but it thrives in the hands of many. Today we planted seeds. Tomorrow we will nurture them. and one day, we will see the forest grow. Closing the notebook, Amara felt a sense of calm settle over her. The journey ahead was daunting, but she was ready. Because justice wasn't a destination, it was a constant, evolving pursuit. And Amara Johnson, with her quiet strength and unwavering resolve, was determined to keep walking that path. Months later, the framework introduced at the summit began to bear fruit. Nations reported improved equity in aid distribution, and marginalized communities began to see tangible changes. The story of Amara's airport experience spread, sparking conversations about bias and systemic inequality in spaces far beyond the UN. Eliana Mendez emerged as a rising leader, inspired by Amara's mentorship. She carried forward the lessons of the summit, championing change in her own nation with a passion that was unstoppable. And Amara? She continued her work, one summit, one meeting, one moment at a time. Her voice remained steady, her resolve unshaken, as she walked the path of justice with the quiet certainty of someone who knew the world could, and would, change. And so, what started as an act of prejudice turned into a powerful reminder that respect and dignity should never be tied to appearances. This story isn't just about one woman's resilience. It's about the change we can all inspire by standing firm against bias and injustice. If this story moved you, made you think, or sparked something inside you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. There are more powerful stories like this one waiting to be told, and I can't wait to share them with you. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.